Today we are going to look at Esther in the rabbinic tradition. And so we're going to look at excerpts from a text which is called the Targum Rishon of Esther. I'll explain it in a moment why it's Rishon, because there's also a Sheni. But what does the word Targum mean? Anybody know? Translation. Targum means translation. So, you know, really, your books that you have in front of you with the biblical text translated into English is a Targum. But when we say Targum with a capital T, we're referring to an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, or a book of the Hebrew Bible. And the reason, there are Targumim for almost every book of the Bible, with the exception of Daniel, which is, much of it is already in Aramaic language, and also in Ezra and Nehemiah, which are also a lot in Aramaic. The rest of the books of the Bible do exist also in Targum. The purpose of a Targum, these texts were written at various times during the rabbinic period, so kind of from the time of the Mishnah, the earliest rabbis, the time of the Mishnah, all the way through the end of the Babylonian Talmud period, and maybe even a little later than that. There were Targumim produced because Aramaic was the vernacular spoken by the Jews in the land of Israel and also in the Babylonian diaspora. So the vernacular is the spoken language, just like English is our vernacular, theirs was Aramaic. So the texts exist in translation into Aramaic, but they are not just straight translations of the biblical text. The Targumim are midrashic translations. So they give a version of the story that tracks the story but supplements it with a midrashim from the rabbis. Now, let's think about the function of a Targum. What do you think the purpose of a Targum would be? Sandy?
To make the basic story accessible to the people.
Okay, to make the story accessible because the people, the lay people in the community spoke Aramaic. They didn't speak Hebrew in the same way that we speak English.
And when you put midrashim in there, it was to really help the people who may speak the language Aramaic, but aren't intellectual enough to get the gist of it or get the meaning of it, so they would, the same way we tell midrash to kids, so that they get it.
So you get it, okay, good. Phyllis?
Maybe also to clean up parts that they didn't watch, that don't look good, or to change slightly.
Right.
A couple of things to fit their political.
Good. I mean, our religious or ideological goals. I mean, that's for sure. We're going to see that in our study of Esther. How the Targum of Esther has supplements and so forth that address some of the problems that we've identified in the book of Esther, because the goal in the Targum was not only to make the text accessible, but also to convey a certain understanding of the text. Right? Now, it would be like if JPS or the Plout or whatever translated the text, but then supplemented it with the writer's own interpretations of it. We don't really do it that way anymore because our communities have interest in understanding the quote-unquote direct translation, but you should always be aware that any translation is always interpretive and is always a commentary, right? So you find that even when you read in the Plout or the Women's Commentary or this, and there are, you see it when we do a Torah study on Shabbat mornings, and we'll point out some of the nuances. But one that's very obvious is how in the books that we use, the modern Plout and the Women's Commentary, there are no gendered pronouns for God, right? So we translate God as the eternal, or God, and using the word God, the eternal, never him or he. Well, that's an interpretive translation because Hebrew is a gendered language, and it uses gendered pronouns. but the translations that we use come not only to tell us what the text says, but also to convey the ideological messages of our community, which is that God is neither male nor female, right? So translation is always interpreted. And even when somebody is striving to give the closest possible faithful translation to the text, it's still interpreted, right? Because you have to make judgments as a translator, about how do I render this word? How do I make this particular phrase intelligible in English idiom? Okay, so that's always true. Now this is just we would call it maybe a very liberal translation, because as you'll see, the translator is deliberately as part of his ideological aim, including rabbinic midrash in the rendering of the text. Okay, and this is done in a way where it's a telling of the story in full order in the same way that it is in the book, as opposed to collections of midrashim, which are each midrash is an interpretation or a little teaching that is kind of self-contained and doesn't necessarily track the order of the story. A targum flows along with the book. It is a full self-contained narrative in its own right. So that's what we're going to see when we read the Targum of Esther. Now there are two Targumim of Esther that exist. The Targum Rishon and the Targum Sheni, the first Targum and the second Targum. Now that doesn't necessarily indicate their chronological order of composition. According to the scholarship that I've read, they're roughly dated to about the same time period, but we don't really know which one came first or which one came second. They're dated to sometime around the end of the 6th century or the beginning of the 7th century of the Common Era, so around the end of the Talmudic period. Okay. And actually the Targum Sheni is probably the better known one, to the extent that people are familiar with it, but it's very, very long. The Targum Rishon is more condensed, so we're going to be looking at excerpts from Targum Rishon just because I think it's a little easier to work with, but they both reflect the same kind of style. All right, so I'm going to pass these out.
Were they meant to be read in place of, do you have that?
Yeah, okay, good question. That's the other thing I meant to say. So, in terms of the usage of the Targum, as early as the Mishnaic period, in the Tosefta, which is rabbinic literature contemporaneous with the Mishnah, there is reference to Targum of Esther. But the sages talk about the practice of using Targum liturgically. So what they say in respect to both reading from the Torah and also reading from the book of Esther, all liturgical readings of texts, the text, the Hebrew text, would be read, and then there would be a translator called a Meturgaman, who would stand next to the reader and give a translation, give the Targum. Okay, so it'd be kind of like in our chapel during services, if we read from the Torah scroll, and then there was somebody reading from the Plaut at the same time. Okay, that practice, that's old. That existed as early as the period of the Mishnah. It's something you would think that we would do today.
Yeah,
just to kind of like
read a line and then
translate.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really do that anymore.
No.
I don't know. I don't know why. We haven't really talked about it. It's just that we have a practice of reading, and people have the books to follow along. Now, in the rabbinic period, people didn't have books, right, to follow along with. So maybe that's an answer. So you can say, well, the people in the congregation can listen to the Hebrew being read, but they have the books in front of them and can read the translation. In the period of the rabbis, they didn't have books. Most people were not literate. So there would be somebody reading the Hebrew and then a maturgaman giving the translation. What's interesting about that is that liturgically, when this is not just for Torah study and study in the Beit Midrash, liturgically in the synagogue, when the sacred texts are read, the people who are hearing them, they're hearing the Hebrew, which they don't understand, and then they're hearing the Aramaic, which they do understand, and that's the Midrashic Targum, right? So really, all they know of the book is the Midrashic interpretations of it, the rabbi's interpretation. So Phyllis mentioned kind of political aims. That's very political. That's the rabbis controlling the meaning of the text, right? Because when you hear, all you hear is their interpretation of it. As far as you know, that's all it is. That's the interpretation. In our day, you've got the straight translation, apart from what I said before, and I can give a Devar Torah and give you an interpretation of it, and you can compare that against what you read in the translation. The lay people back then couldn't do that. All they heard was just the Midrash, right? So that's one way in which the rabbis asserted control over the meaning of the text. Okay. Does anybody not have one? Okay. All right. So we're going to go through. You have your Tanakh with you. Just open up to the book of Esther, and we'll look kind of side by side with the biblical version of Esther with the Targum. I've given you a lot of passages from the Targum that I want to get through. So I don't think we'll read the passage from the Tanakh and then look at it in the Targum. Just for yourself, have it next to you, and you can kind of compare. And we'll stop, we'll read each passage, and then kind of discuss what we see. Okay? So we are going to begin at the beginning, very beginning of the Targum. So start with, open your books to Esther chapter 1, very beginning of the book, which, remember, describes, tells us about King Ahasuerus, and then that chapter proceeds to describe the big banquets, etc., that he threw, right? And we talked in our first class about the lavishness of the banquet. Now let's look at how this is depicted in the Targum. Lynn, do you want to start there? No, it happened. Yeah.
It happened during the days of the wicked Xerxes, in whose days the decree allowed work on the house of the great God was revoked. It remained revoked until the second year of Darius, on the advice of the sinful Vashti, daughter of evil Mordecai, Merodach, son of Nebuchadnezzar. Because she did not permit the rebuilding of the temple, it was decreed she be executed anew. And because Xerxes listened to her advice, his life was shortened and his kingdom was split up. Previously, all peoples, nations, and speakers of various languages and provinces were under his rule, but now they were no longer subjected to him. In view of this fact, and subsequently, when it was revealed before the Lord that Vashti would be killed and that he was destined to marry Esther, who is a descendant of Sarah, who lived 127 years, he was given an extension, and he ruled 127 provinces from India to western Ethiopia. It was in those days that King Xerxes wished to sit on the royal throne of Solomon, which was captured from Jerusalem by Shishak, king of Egypt, and from Egypt it was captured by Sennacherib. Sennacherib it was captured by Hezekiah, and returned to Jerusalem, and then again captured from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and brought down to Babylon. When Cyrus the Mede conquered Babylonia, he brought it down to Elam. Thereafter Xerxes ruled and wished to sit upon it, but was not able to. So he ordered that architects be brought from Alexandria to produce one like it, but they were unable. Instead, they made another one inferior to it. They were busy for 2 years with it. In the 3rd year of his reign. He sat on it, on that very throne of his kingdom, which the architect designed for him in the house of Susa.
Keep going, we're reading through verse 5.
Okay. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a great banquet for all his princes and his servants, the Persians and the leading groups, the garrisons and the nobles who were appointed over the provinces. Those came wrapped in wool garments and dressed in purple. They ate, drank, and rejoiced in his presence. After they ate and drank and delighted themselves, he showed them his wealth, which was left to him by Cyrus and Mede. Even Cyrus found that wealth when, upon capturing Babylonia, he dug in the bank of the Euphrates and discovered there 680 copper vessels filled with pure gold, sparkling gems, yellow emeralds, and other types of gems. And through that wealth, his glory intensified, and the power of his kingdom grew. So he made a banquet and drinking parties for all his servants for many days, for 180 days. When the days of the drinking party were finished, the king made for the entire people of the house of Israel who were found guilty in the fortress of Susa, who were counted among the uncircumcised inhabitants of the land, both great and small. The drinking party for 7 days in the courtyard of the inner garden of the king, in which were planted fruit-bearing trees and spices, half overlaid with fine gold and finished with a setting of gems covering them from above. But Mordecai and his associates were not there.
Okay, so there's a lot happening in this first passage, right? So let's go back and review it and see, just like we did last time, in comparing the Masoretic text with the Alpha text to see what kind of story it's telling. Let's do the same thing here as we read this argument. So what do you see in this introduction to the book that's significant in terms of the story that the Midrash is telling, the Targum is telling?
My reaction was about Vashti.
Okay, what do we learn about Vashti?
Well, that she was sinful, that she wouldn't allow the temple to be built.
Okay,
I
right.
always wondered when I would read that story why she was so punished like she was for what she did.
Okay.
Bad.
Right, so Vashti is cast here as wicked. She's called the wicked Vashti. She's wicked because she was whispering in the king's ear and telling him, do not allow the temple to be rebuilt. Let's think about how this works in terms of history. Remember, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And it was the king, which king that led the Babylonians? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? He destroyed the first temple, and then it began to be rebuilt under the Persian Empire under Cyrus. Okay? Now, it looks like Xerxes here, and I didn't look this up to see the order, but I'm gathering from this that Xerxes, who was Ahasuerus, reigned after Cyrus. Okay? So Cyrus initiated the rebuilding of the temple. He allowed it. But then Xerxes came in, according to the Midrash, so historically correct. But according to Midrash, he came in and stopped it. Okay? And he stopped it on the advice of Vashti. And who is Vashti? What's her lineage, do we learn here? She's the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Okay, so she was Babylonian, according to this tradition, and was married into the Persian Empire, and she's behind the whole thing why the temple, the construction was stopped. So she's in the Midrash. Vashti is not a good character. It's interesting when you think about how we read the story of Esther, and oftentimes Vashti is held up as kind of like a strong heroine figure because the king is this drunk buffoon who says, come and show off your beauty, and she says no, and she gets exiled. But here, she's cast very differently. She's wicked, right? All right, what else do you see here that's significant?
The whole history of the temple was destroyed.
Uh-huh.
Well, whole history, who was captured, what happened
Yeah, okay, it situates it in the context of Jewish history more clearly than the biblical text does. What else?
Interestingly, it shows unity in two different ways. Here in this story, she was executed in the nude. For
Right.
what reason we do not know. And of course, we know.
Well, she's
how-
executed in the nude because,
she-
yeah, here it says, because she forbid the building of the temple.
Right,
We're going to
like
see
she-
more on that.
But instead, that also gives her a lot of power. If she was close to overturning the rebuilding of the temple, she must have been very powerful, as
Yeah.
it appears in our familiar story.
Right, she's very powerful.
Uh-huh.
I mean, she had the king's ear. I mean, she, you know, and then she's later on, because she makes him mad, she's executed. But she seems to have been a very powerful figure in the king's life and in his government.
And this double humiliates her. If she were executed in the nude,
Yeah.
that's a humiliation.
Right, now let's just look in our biblical text to understand where they get that in the Midrash, that she's executed in the nude. Can you find it, Phyllis? What's the order the king says to Vashti in the biblical text?
I'm wearing the crown.
Come wearing your crown, right? Can
Period.
somebody find it?
Yes.
Yes, folks.
Yes, right.
And nothing else.
Right? Okay, so the biblical text says, you know, the king's order to her is, come wearing your royal crown, or something like that, right?
To display her beauty.
And so to display her beauty. So the
Wearing a royal
Midrash,
diadem, right.
wearing the royal diadem on her head. So the Midrash reads that he instructed her to come wearing the royal diadem, but nothing else,
Right.
right? Okay, so it's kind of also a great humiliation to her, it would seem, by the king. But this gives us some context. The opening to the Targum gives us some context for the king's order to begin with. That she, you know, that she's this big, powerful influence here, and she is stopping the construction of the temple, and we're going to read more about her in a second. Yeah, Phil.
It also mentions God and the Lord, which
Right.
doesn't happen in the whole book.
Good, that's important here, because God is mentioned. Remember, we've learned already that in the Masoretic text, God is not mentioned in Esther. Here, God's mentioned right at the outset. And what is God's role here? Yeah, God. Well, not only does God know what's going on,
Yeah.
it's a plan. It's a divine plan, right? That God saw, as it were, kind of how events were going to unfold before him. It says it was revealed before God. God sees this playing out. That with Vashti gone, the queen will marry Esther. This is going to lead to the various events unfolding. And so Vashti's refusal to come, the whole thing, that's part of a divine plan as it's presented here. Now, already off the bat, we see a striking difference with the Masoretic text, especially the way we read it last time in comparison with the Alpha text, because we saw that one of the key messages that the Masoretic editor was trying to get across was that the fact that history happens by chance, events happen by chance, right? And by his removal of God and so forth, he's trying to convey that. Well, the Midrash is repairing that already. Phyllis said one of the reasons for a Targum is to teach the text in a way that fixes problems with it. Well, you can see that the rabbis see a big problem with the fact that God is missing from the text of Esther, and also that idea that things happen by chance. That's not the rabbinic worldview. The rabbinic worldview is that God's hand is behind everything in history. So they read that into the text through Midrash, right? So what the listeners in the congregation are hearing when the story is read, they're hearing this: that God is behind it all, starting with the overthrow of Vashti. Okay? Yep.
I have a question. It's here you have Vashti executed because she was trying to prevent the reconstruction of the temple. So that is a pro-Jewish action.
Right.
Okay, so now we have the leader being pro-Jewish. You can't stand in my way to help the Jews? I don't understand.
What
how
leader?
that-
No. Stopping the destruction of the temple is bad for
I
the Jews.
understand, but
So Vashti is bad.
I can't pronounce it, Xerxes.
Xerxes.
Xerxes, okay, so he was then pro-Jewish?
That's how he's being cast here.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Pro-Jewish, well, not really pro-Jewish. Remember, he listened to Vashti's advice. And so he was going to be punished. The text says, he had listened to her. She's whispering in his ear, stop the rebuilding of the temple. He went along with it, and he was about to be punished and kind of deposed, or at least diminished in his power, as a result of listening to her. But then, as God kind of saw it all playing out, God gave him a stay of execution in that sense, and just got rid of Vashti so that Esther could come in.
But who got rid of Vashti?
The king did, but he's doing it all as like an agent of God's plan.
Gotcha, okay.
Yeah,
It doesn't-
God's hand is behind everything
Okay.
in the Midrash, from here all through the book. So he becomes an agent
Right.
of God. Maybe an unknowing agent, but nevertheless, he's an agent of carrying out the divine plan. All right, what else do you notice here? Let's talk about. Remember, the beginning of Esther in the Masoretic text talks about the lavishness of the party, and we ask the question: what's the deal with all of this description? That you have a whole chapter talking about how lavish and ornate and all the jewels and everything. We said, what's the significance of that? Because it really didn't have to have it. You could paint. I mean, we said that it shows the king's obsession with material things and with not affairs of state and all that. But still, that could have been done in shorter fashion. The Midrash then makes a lot of it. What do we learn about it? Yeah.
I'm not sure, but is the wool garments and the purple copying the clothing of the priests?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Midrash is making that connection explicit. They're saying that all the king's wealth, all these jewels and everything, this was stolen from the temple, right? This was taken from the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar when he destroyed it, and then it was bequeathed, to him, and then it came into the hands of the Persian Empire when they conquered Babylonia. So that's why we, according to the Targum, why in chapter 1 spend so much time talking about the king's wealth, because it's all expropriated from the Beit HaMikdash. Now, what can we learn from it? What do you think is the message of that, or what is a message of that connection?
It says here that after they ate and drank, he showed them his wealth,
Right.
which meant that he was creating political capital. He was saying, this is what I've got, not just this is what I got from my father.
Right.
This is what I got because of my power for our conquering of that people.
Right.
This is what we've got, and
Okay.
it would encourage further obedience to him as a ruler, as a
Okay. Good.
political leader.
Yeah. Think about. Has anybody been to Rome?
Yes.
Okay. So have you seen the Arch of Titus? Okay. So the Arch of Titus. What does the Arch of Titus depict? Relief.
No.
Not the Babylonians.
Second temple.
The destruction of the Second Temple by Rome. Right? And what does it show? What does it show?
They were brought to Rome as the Jews were brought to Rome as slaves.
Yeah, it shows the general leading this whole kind of caravan of Jews and in bondage and slaves, and also stuff, all kinds of stuff, right? And so that Titus, who was he was the general that destroyed Jerusalem, that is commemorated, memorialized in that arch, because it's like you say, the victor shows to the world, our power because we vanquished these people and brought all their stuff here, right? And not only the Arch of Titus, but when I was in Rome last January, I learned that the Colosseum in Rome was built, at least in part, using wealth that was taken from Jerusalem, from Rome's destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, and they use it to build themselves up. Okay, so this here, the Targum is making that connection, saying that Ahasuerus's grandeur and his power is built on our backs, really. I mean, remember, this text is rabbinic material, so this is already knowing the history of Rome and everything. And you have to kind of see that they're talking about Rome, too, through the text. Okay, so that's one thing that we can learn. Something else about the connection with the temple. So you pointed out, Phyllis, that a lot of the materials here, and we see that when you just read the biblical text, the materials are very similar to what's described in Exodus in the chapters about the construction of the Mishkan. You can do a parallel text analysis where you see just how extensive the descriptions are. And when you put those together, I think a message that comes through for me in that is that materials, gold, wood, all this kind of stuff that's being described here, they are purpose neutral, or morally neutral, right? Which is they're used in Exodus 27, 25, whatever, forward, to build the Mishkan, which is the dwelling place for God. They're used here in Esther to build the palace of Ahasuerus. Right? I mean, they're just things. They have no moral valence to them, or purpose valence to them. The question that it raises for me then is for us to think about, how we utilize wealth and stuff. Because when in the construction of the Mishkan, these things are put to the purpose of creating sacred space, the place for God to dwell. I mean, the highest. In Esther, they're put to the use of the king, having these hedonistic drinking parties and buffoonery and all kinds of, licentiousness. Right? It just all depends on how you use wealth. So I learned from reading this, when I read this Targum, it really brought it into relief for me that it's challenging us to think about how we utilize the wealth that we have and the stuff that we have. Are we using it for the purpose of creating sacredness? Or are we using it for the purpose of showing off and bragging and showing how much we have and buffoonery? Right? So that's, I think, an important lesson. Something we can use when we think about bar mitzvah parties and weddings and what have you, right? Very relevant question. All right, anything else you see in here? Joe?
About Esther, trying to make her lineage be very, very important.
Right, she's a descendant of Sarah. Okay?
So
Now, as a Jew, you would think, so everybody's kind of a descendant of Sarah, but nevertheless, it points it out. But the 127 is significant. Remember, Fox had pointed out that 127 provinces was historically inaccurate in terms of the Persian Empire. But the 127 comes, we already looked at that before, the connection with Sarah's life. The Targum makes that explicit. That this whole thing is, this is God behind it, making Esther. Esther is so significant because of her connection with Sarah. And we'll see, the significance of others. All right, so let's move on then to the next passage I want to read. It's on page 34. I have it number 2 marked. Okay, this is still in chapter 1. Oh, there was one other thing that we didn't mention. It's really important. I'm sorry. Back in the passage that we read, the very end of it. The very end of it on page 32. So remember, the king, the biblical text tells us that the king there was a series of parties. First, he had 180 days for all the officers and ministers of the realm. Then he had another party for 7 days. What does it say in the biblical text? He threw for 7 days for who? The people of Shushan? No, and look in the Bible. After the 180 days, then
He had a
it's
banquet for all the officials and warriors.
in Shushan.
Yes.
Okay, so, right. So he's got the big 180-day party, then he has a 7-day party. The Targum tells us that the 7-day party was attended by who? By the Jews who were in Shushan. Now this is, I think, also an ideological statement. Okay, it's interesting, but it's also ideological, going back to what we discussed last time about Jews and their relationship to foreign rulers. All right, so it says, it was attended by the house of Israel, and these people were counted among the uncircumcised and the whatever. Right, the Targum is talking about, these were the assimilated Jews who they lived in the fortress of Shushan. That's the king's palace complex area. They were working for the government. They were totally assimilated, uncircumcised, and all that. They came to this party was for them, or at least they were attendees at the party, right? But who was not there? Mordecai did not go.
And probably weren't serving kosher.
And that's right. That's right. We're going to see that. Okay, Mordecai and his associates didn't go. Now that's important to mention because Mordecai also works in the palace complex. We learned that about him. So he would have been part of the people invited, but he didn't go. This is Mordecai separating himself from the assimilated Jews. Right, Joe?
In the Bible, it mentions about the king's closest advisors, and it mentions them by name. Are we to assume that they are Jewish?
No. That's mentioning that those are the 7 top advisors that exiled Vashti. Those aren't Jews. No, but what the Targum is telling us is there were lots of Jews who worked for the king, who were part of the administration and what have you, and they were assimilated, and they show up in there, and we're going to see. I can't remember if I gave it to you, but the Targum does say that they were serving all kinds of treif at the banquet and everything, and so they're eating it, so they're punished for it. Part of it even said that. I think, did we read it? It says they were guilty, right? So the Targum is reading kind of the rise of Haman, and Haman's plot against the Jews, as in part, remember, God's hand is behind all of it, as a punishment against the assimilated Jews for turning on Judaism. Okay, yeah, Joe.
So did the assimilated Jews consider themselves Jews?
I don't know. It's a good question. But they were Jews.
Well, yeah, when the edict goes out, they'll be the ones.
Yeah, right.
Okay, now let's turn to page 34. So, Sandy, you want to read remark number 2?
Also, the wicked Queen Vashti made a feast for the women in the royal palace in the place of the bedroom of King Xerxes. Now the righteous Mordecai had been praying to the Lord since the first day of the feast until the 7th day, the Sabbath. He ate no bread and drank no water. Then on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath day, his complaint and the complaint of the Sanhedrin came before the Lord.
Okay, pause there. So again, we see God. Mordecai is praying to God. He's conscious of the Sabbath. This is creating Mordecai as a contrast to those Jews who came to the king's party. Mordecai is a religious man, right? He prays to God. He observes Shabbat. Okay? That's important for us to understand in terms of the story that the Targum is telling us. Okay, keep going.
When the king's heart became cheerful through wine, the Lord incited against him the angel of confusion to confound their festivities. And thus he said to Mehucham, Dizda, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zepher, and Carcass. Mehuman, who was appointed over trouble. Dizda, shame of the house. Harbona, I will destroy his house. Bigtha and Abagtha, the master of the universe, is going to squeeze you like a man who squeezes his grapes with a wine press twice. And he is going to destroy and crush these 7 princes who attended King Xerxes during these 7
I think
days.
these are all linguistic connections with their...
Yeah, right.
Okay. Keep going.
The king then ordered these 7 princes to bring Queen Vashti in the nude. because she used to make Israelite girls work in the nude and made them beat wool and flax on the Sabbath day, therefore it was decreed upon her to be brought out in the nude. However, the crown of royalty was on her head because of the merit of her father's father, Nebuchadnezzar, who dressed Daniel in purple. For that reason, it was decreed that she came before him with the crown of royalty to show the nations and the princes her beauty, since she was good-looking. Queen Vashti, however, refused to come according to the decree of the order of the Lord and the king, as ordered by the princes. Whereupon the king became extremely angry, and his fury burned in.
Okay, so see how this is playing out now. The God has orchestrated the whole thing. Part of it is for Vashti to show up in the nude. That's punishment to her because of how she treated the Jewish women as queen. And she's wicked, right? And she made them work in the nude, so she has to be humiliated in the nude. That's the rabbinic attribute, rabbinic principle of punishment called midah keneged midah, measure for measure, right? What the sin that you commit is brought back on you. Okay, so that was God's plan for her. Well, then she refused to come, so she's not contravening only the king's order; she's contravening God's order, right? And this is why she's, executed. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. Any thoughts else on that passage?
Seven. The number 7 appears again.
Oh, 7,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right, the
So
7.
around 7.
Yeah.
It also mentions Daniel. Now,
Yeah.
was that written before? I thought Daniel was in the subsequent text.
Well, but it's Daniel's before the Targum. Remember, the Targum is putting its own knowledge.
So we already know about Daniel.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, let's move forward now to the page 41, which is the next page, where I have number 3. Okay. Now here, in number 3, we're in chapter 2 of the story. This is the introduction of Mordecai and Esther. All right, so we've already learned a little bit about Mordecai, right? That he works for the king in the king's gate, but he distances himself from the assimilated Jews who work here. He's a pious man. He prays. He observes the Shabbat, etc. Now we're going to meet Mordecai again and Esther. Erwin, you want to read?
There was in the fortress of Susa a pious man who prayed before God for his people. He was called by the name of Mordecai because he was comparable to pure myrrh. The son of Jair, the son of Shimi, the son of Kish, a man from the tribe of Benjamin. That is Shimi, who insulted David and whom Joab wanted to kill. But he, David, did not let him do it because he consulted the spirit of prophecy and foresaw that Mordecai and Esther, the redeemers, will descend from him.
Okay, that's hearkening back to the biblical, to the stories of King David, all the way to Samuel, and this was an enemy. Mordecai's ancestor was an enemy of David, but we'll have to look back at the story some other time. That David wanted to kill the guy, but he was forestalled. And the reason for that, according to Midrash, is because this guy was going to be the progenitor of Mordecai and Esther. And remember, this is all unfolding before God. God sees the whole thing. Okay, so it's all part of a big plan. Okay, keep going.
So when Shimi ceased to procreate, David ordered his son Solomon to kill him.
Okay, so after all the kids. Okay, keep going.
Who went into exile from Jerusalem with the exile which was banished with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, exiled. But when Cyrus and Darius captured Babylon, Mordecai left Babylonia with Daniel and the entire community of Israel which was there in Babylonia, and went up with King Cyrus to live in the fortress of Susa. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his father's brother. Now, why did they call her Hadassah? Because she was a righteous woman, and the righteous ones are compared to the myrtle. They called her Esther after the shining star, which the Greeks called Asterah. They called her Esther because she was concealed in the home of Mordecai for 75 years, where she saw no man's face except that of Mordecai, who became her nursing father. And at the time of the death of her father, she was still in her mother's womb. And as soon as her mother gave birth to her, her mother died. Mordecai took her into his house and called her daughter.
Okay, so we get with Esther, we get an elaboration of names. Remember, the biblical text says it's Hadassah, that is Esther. But we get an understanding of her name. She has both a Jewish and a non-Jewish name, which we discussed before. And Esther, again, she says she was concealed because the Hebrew, Hester means hiding. All right, so they're making that connection with Esther. It's hiding. She was concealed. Also in Midrash, which doesn't show up here, but the sages say that we learn from this name that God is concealed in the book. God is hiding. That's why God's name isn't mentioned. Again, for the same reason. So she grew up at Mordecai's house. She's 75. But she's never seen anybody, never left the house, right? And Mordecai, what do we learn about him? Just in terms of his history. Familial relationships. Okay, but what else?
He took a child into his home.
Yeah, he took a
But
child.
what we
in.
know here, he was single himself.
Okay. Good, and he came with the exile along with this king, and he came with Cyrus. I mean, Mordecai is connected, right? He's very prominent, both in the Jewish community, but also with the foreign rulers. Okay, and that's an important part of the plot, how he has access. I mean, remember, he's inside the whole palace complex. He knows what's going on. The book of Esther itself never really addresses how Mordecai has all this privileged information and how he has such access, but we learn it here. He's a very prominent figure. Okay? All right.
It's very.
Let's keep going.
It's very interesting. The Esther, maybe because God is hidden.
Right. That's another part of Midrash which isn't included in the Targum.
But
yeah.
also, how come the Rabbi didn't see the names of Esther and Mordecai as Ashtar and Marduk?
Yeah, they did.
The goddess-
We did talk about that before.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Now let's look at number 4. Right, number 4. Number 4. All right, we're in chapter 2. Now remember, the narrative goes on that then there's the whole king selecting a new queen and the preparation with the cosmetics, etc. And then she's chosen as the queen. Again, according to the Targum, this is all divine plan.
And she's at 75 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's, whatever. She's beautiful. So it's all according to divine plan. Now look at verse 20, where I marked number 4. Phyllis?
With the passing of each day, the king asked her, "From which nation are you descended?" But Esther did not relate the identity of her birthplace and her people as Mordecai had ordered her. In Mordecai's order, Esther obeyed. Sabbaths and festivals she would observe. During the days of separation, she watched herself. She cooked dishes and wine of the nations she did not taste. And all the religious precepts which the women of the house of Israel were commanded, she observed by order of Mordecai, just as she observed them when she grew up with him.
All right, pause there. Now, why is this midrashic addition important, you think, for the sages?
Her commitment to being a Jew.
Yeah, her
Even though
commitment to
it
being a Jew,
Hidden Jew.
being hidden, and why is it especially important to mention it, given, the storyline here?
Because all the other Jews weren't doing that.
Right, and also, where is she? I mean, what's her role now? She's the queen of Persia. She lives right in the heart of the palace. I mean, so you would think that Esther, it would be difficult for her to do this, and also that if anybody's going to become assimilated, it would be Esther. She's married to the king. I mean, already you have the problem of the fact that she's sleeping with the king, which is a problem because it's forbidden by the Torah to have relations with a non-Jew.
But the text doesn't tell us that she didn't eat the food in the palace.
No, the biblical text doesn't. That's
You
midrash.
assume that she's eating not kosher.
That's what I'm saying.
food.
And that's why it's
Right.
important for the Targum to put this in, to tell you that despite what you might think about her living in the palace, Esther would remain a committed Jew. She separated herself from the king when she was in menstruation. She observed the holidays. She didn't eat non-kosher food. All of these things. Okay? Now, the issue of her having sexual relations with the king remains a problem. Okay? But and the Talmud spends a significant amount of time dealing with that. That they said the Talmud says that Esther was only a passive participant in it, and B, she did it because it was for the sake of saving the Jewish people. Okay, that's the only reason.
There's no children from that.
Right, and that it was something she had to do, she had to submit in order for the good of the Jewish people. Okay? But the rabbis are very concerned, obviously, about this. Esther's a big hero in the Tanakh, and we don't want to have a hero who eats tray food and has sex with non-Jews. And I mean, they got to have to address that. And that's what they do. Okay? All right, let's turn now, let's keep going where you left off.
In those days, while Mordecai sat among the Sanhedrin, which Esther set up for him, at the king's gate, and when the two officers saw this, they became agitated and got...
Uh-oh. Did I skip a page?
Yes.
Oh,
Got
shit.
something you mentioned, Mark.
I don't know, I skipped a page. Page 49. Okay, they got angry. So when the two officers saw this, now remember, these are the two officers who plot against the king's life. Right? Mordecai, in the biblical text, it says Mordecai overheard this, or whatever, that they were doing it. The Targum is coming to explain what, give us context. Why are they plotting? What's the deal? How does Mordecai overhear it? Okay? So it's when the two officers saw this, meaning that Mordecai was sitting among the Sanhedrin in the king's gate, and we'll have to talk about that in a second, they became agitated and got angry, saying to each other, "Does not the queen by the decree wish to remove us and install Mordecai? It is not dignified to remove two jesters and to install one." So the Tarsusians, Bigtan and Teresh, the two officers of the king, the guardians of the palace, counseled each other, speaking in their language, and decided to give Queen Esther a drink of deadly poison and to stretch out a hand against King Xerxes to kill him by sword in his bedchamber. The matter became known to Mordecai because he was well versed in speaking 70 languages, and he related it to Queen Esther. So Esther notified the king, and it was recorded in Mordecai's name. The matter was then investigated, and the truth was discovered, so they were both hanged on the gallows. And the matter was recorded in the books of the Chronicles, which was constantly read before the king. All right, so the Targum fills in some blanks here. Why did the two guys want to plot against the king? It doesn't tell us in the biblical text. We learn it's here because they're angry about Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, we already learned in the biblical text, he sits in the king's gate, meaning he's an official in the government somehow. Okay? But we learn from the Targum that he sits with the Sanhedrin. What's the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is a court, it's a rabbinic court. Okay? This is the rabbis reading their own institutions and what have you into the text. But Mordecai is part of the Sanhedrin, according to the Midrash. So, remember we read about the party early on that Mordecai and his associates didn't come. Who are his associates? In the biblical text, he doesn't have any associates. Here he does. His associates are the other members of the Sanhedrin. So this is these are the pious, traditionalist Jews on the one hand, and then you have the assimilationists on the other hand. The Jewish community here is split, or at least at the elite levels of it. We learn from the Targum. Okay, and Mordecai is a big shot. He sits on the Sanhedrin, and he speaks the 70 languages. That's how he understands when they're plotting. Okay?
Does it mean that Esther created the Sanhedrin? Or was her power?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess as she's the queen, and not that, I don't know.
You haven't identified who the king is.
No, but according to here, yeah, remember, I think this is part of Esther's piety, and the characterization of Esther as a pious Jew. So not only does she keep her personal observance, but she establishes a rabbinic court in her realm. Okay? I think that's what they're saying.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah, Marilyn?
I can't understand a lot of this, so as I read it, I wondered if it meant that Esther got him the seat.
No, I don't think that Esther got him the seat.
He created it.
But she established the Sanhedrin, and Mordecai he's a very learned, prominent man in the community. So to sit on the Sanhedrin, one has to be incredibly, deeply learned and pious. So all of this, I think, is going to create the characters, right? Okay, let's keep going. We also learned about why she's concealing her identity. Remember, the story of Esther tells us she just kept quiet. Mordecai says, keep quiet. We don't really quite learn why. Here we learn it's so that she can establish kind of her own space to observe the Torah while she's queen. Okay? All right, so let's continue with chapter 3. We're at Mark number 5. Chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3 is the elevation of Haman. Mrs. B, your turn.
After these things, the attribute of justice entered before the master of the world. And thus it said, did not the wicked Haman descend and go up from Susa to Jerusalem to abolish the building of the temple? And now, the Lord of Haman, son of Amminadab, who is descended from Akka, son of the wicked Amalek, and has appointed him chief over everything and established his throne over those of all the princes that are with him, who bind the master of the world and his captives. I do not wish to destroy him from the world as long as he is not yet known in the world. Let go of him until he will become great and known among all nations. Then will I punish him for all the oppression that he and his ancestors have done to the people of the house of Israel.
Okay, so let's pause there. What do we learn from this?
Number one, they say he's an Amalekite in the text. It says he's an Amalekite.
So it makes that connection explicit. Haman is an Amalekite. That's the enemy of Israel. Okay, and so that's important. His lineage makes him already an enemy of Israel. Yeah.
As long as he was a minor official and wasn't doing anything particularly active against the Jews, it was okay. He could be privately anti-Semitic, but when he started making these major decrees, that's when he began to realize.
Yeah, okay, but remember, so God is kind of saying, like, let's let him get prominent and known to the world before I do anything to him. Why would God want that?
It's power play. God wants to show, I think, that he doesn't worry about the little people. But when the big people come along, God's got to show his power over the powerful.
Okay, all right. What else? Well, if God destroys Haman and nobody knows who Haman is, what does the world learn from that? Nothing. If God destroys Haman and he's a big mocker in the government and he's a big known anti-Semite, what does the world learn from not only God's power, but also that an enemy, that somebody who comes against Israel is going to get it. Right? I mean, so this is God is elevating Haman to prominence so that God can destroy him in public view, so that everybody sees it. So you don't want to be like Haman, right? That's the kind of the message here. It's the converse, not the converse, but it's the version. In some sense, it's kind of the same idea as with Abraham, but for evil people. Because Abraham, in Midrash, Abraham gets, it says, God tested Abraham and tells him to sacrifice his son. And the Midrash spends time asking, why does God do this? To Abraham. And why had God put him through so many tests and then culminates the 10th one with the Akedah? And the sages say that God does it to raise his banner in the world. Right? It's like he built up Abraham so that he's got a reputation as a righteous man and someone who follows God and everything. And then he does the Akedah so that the world will see what a righteous person is like. If Abraham was an anonymous guy, then the fact that he does great things for God is that nobody knows about it. So God's name isn't glorified in the world. Right? So God raises up Abraham so that everybody will see it. Here too, you have God raises up Haman so that everybody will see it. And God's justice will be known in the world. Okay? So, and that's why it begins with this, is the attribute of justice entered before the master of the world. It's a part of God, right? God is acting here with the elevation of Haman. God is acting with the attribute of justice. This is to make justice known in the world. Okay? Let's see. Okay, keep going. Who was reading?
Now all the king's servants that were at the king's gate bowed down to the image which he set upon his chest and prostrated themselves to him. For that is what the king had commanded concerning him. Mordecai, however, would not bow down, nor prostrate himself to him, because he was his working slave who was sold to him.
Okay, so we get a couple of things here. One, remember we talked in the first class. What is the problem with, why doesn't Mordecai bow down to Haman? Right? Because it's the initial answer that we give is, well, because the text goes on and says he was a Jew. But there's no problem for Jews to bow down to officials of foreign governments. So what? So then we got a problem. What is it? Why is he refusing? Then we said, well, it's because Haman's an Agagite, he's an Amalekite, and Mordecai is a Jew, and they're mortal enemies. So he doesn't do it. The Targum provides a different explanation for that. And the reason is that Haman wore an idol on his clothing. Okay? So Mordecai refused to bow down, not because he hated Haman, or because Haman was an official in the foreign government, because what Haman was demanding of him was idolatry. To bow down to an idol, and Mordecai refused to do that. Yeah?
What's the word that they use for image?
I don't know.
Is it Salem?
Not sure.
Because
To look at
if
the
it
Arabic
is,
text.
then it is a polemic against Christianity, because that image has come to be known as Jesus, and it's written during the time.
Maybe.
I'm interested.
Yeah, maybe.
What that word is.
Maybe it's, I don't know, but maybe it is a polemic against Christianity. I mean, but in any case, the issue is idolatry. So Mordecai, again, going with Mordecai's piety, he refuses because committing idolatry is a terrible sin. This is not personal pique, right? That's not the kind of guy he is. But you wouldn't get that from the biblical text itself. So, okay, so it supplies it. Now the other thing is, he won't bow to Haman because Haman was his slave that he sold himself to for a loaf of bread. Now what does that sound like? It sounds like an
Jacob and Esau.
like Jacob and Esau, right? Because remember, Esau sold the birthright to Jacob for the stew. Here, Haman, it's an interesting dynamic, and I don't understand fully what the deal is with him being the slave, but at the very least we can see that Haman had given over his rights in certain respect to Mordecai for a loaf of bread. The parallel is clear, and we're going to see it again, that Haman is likened to Esau here. Okay? Haman is likened to Esau. Now, he had maybe he made himself an indentured servant before to Mordecai, and now he gets this big promotion, and he's telling him, bow down to me, and Mordecai's like, well, you work for me. Okay? But I think the important point here is the parallel with Esau. Okay? And Esau, what does Esau symbolize in rabbinic literature? Rome. Right? Rome. Okay? So, and also Christianity. Okay? So here, and by this time, they're kind of one and the same. Rome and Christianity. So the Targum is connecting Haman with that. All of those things, which has valence for the readers. Or for the listeners in the congregation. So when they hear it, they're not only hearing a story about Haman, they're hearing a story about Rome, they're hearing a story about Christians. Okay? You can see that it's has a lot of resonance for them. Okay. Where did we leave off? Oh, okay. Let's continue.
Was there one author for this? Or was there cooperation?
I don't know. I mean, this is, I don't know who authored it or what, but this is kind of taking Midrash and weaving it into a narrative. So the authors of the Midrashim are the sages, and there's many of them. But maybe it's one hand in this text putting it together in a narrative string. All right, let's look at number 6. We're at Mark number 6 now. We're in chapter 3 still. Okay, Fred, you want to read what Haman saw?
When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down to the image nor pay homage to him, Haman became filled with anger against Mordecai. However, it was derisive to him to stretch out a hand to kill just Mordecai alone, for they had told him that Mordecai was descended from Jacob, who took away the birthright from the blessing from Esau, his paternal grandfather, and the Jews, who were among the people of Mordecai. And so Haman sought to wipe out all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes and the people of Mordecai.
Okay, right? So it gives us a rationale for why Haman wants to kill everybody. The biblical text leaves a gap in that, and it's weird. Mordecai won't bow down to him, so he says, I'm going to kill all Jews. Here, we understand it a little bit better. And it's the Jacob-Esau thing. That's what the connection was before. Right? There's this long kind of family rivalry here. And Haman is coming to actualize the enmity of Esau and Amalek and everything against the Jews. That's why he wants to kill everybody. Let's continue on the next page with 7. Now this is remember Haman, so he decides he wants to kill everybody. Then he's going to go before the king and make the presentation to him. You know, why the king should sign off. Let's read it and then jump with it. All right, Susie.
Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered and distinct among the nations. Some of them live throughout all the provinces of your kingdom. The decrees of their law are different from those of every nation. Our bread and our cooked dishes they do not eat. Our wine they do not drink. Our festivals they do not celebrate. And our customs they do not observe. They do not observe the decrees of the king's statutes. The king has no profit from them. What benefit does he have from them if he lets them live on the face of the earth?
Okay, so this supplements Haman's case against the Jews. And what do you notice about it? It's close, but there's more. How is it different?
It's kind of saying all the things that the leaders say are important for Jews, and they don't want them to do. So it's like reinforcing, yes, this is what you're supposed to do. This is
Good, it is reinforcing that. It's also giving us a window into how the sages of the Midrash understand anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. Right? These complaints. This is what people who don't like Jews say about Jews. Right? They don't like us because they don't, they don't eat with us. They don't drink with us. They're different. All that kind of stuff. I mean, these tropes of anti-Semitism are still with us. But this is already going back to the 6th, 7th century. And you see the tropes present. So the authors of the text are putting, Haman he's the anti-Semite in the Bible. He's the quintessential anti-Semite. They're putting into his mouth the words of anti-Semites. This is how they understand anti-Semites. Okay, what they're hearing, I guess, from people who oppose them. Joe, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think I may have answered my own question. I was wondering why Haman would be linked to Esau, because of Esau being Jewish and Mordecai not. But I just remember that Esau turned out to be the gender of the Arab community.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Haman makes a stronger case here in the Targum than he does in the biblical text, and he really kind of gives the voice of the anti-Semite. All right. Let's keep going. Number 8. Here we are in chapter 4. Now this, chapter 4, Haman sets his plan into motion, and chapter 4 begins with saying Mordecai learned about it. And he's bewailing it, and he's walking in front of the palace gate, and bemoaning it, and he's got sackcloth and ashes and everything on. And then he sends a message to Esther and says, you got to do something about it. And he uses this eunuch of the king, Hatach, to carry the message. And Hatach appears here, but then he kind of disappears from the story of Esther. He's not mentioned anymore. So the Midrash kind of picks up on that and explains how it unfolds. Let's start with number 12. Stan?
When the wicked Haman saw Hatach, whose name was Daniel, entering and leaving from Esther, he became furious at him and killed him, whereupon the angel Michael appeared there and related to Mordecai Esther's words.
Okay, so just pause there. So Hatach disappears because Haman intervened. He learns that Mordecai and Esther are trying to communicate about the plot, and Haman kills Hatach. Now Hatach is identified here with Daniel in the Midrash. Okay, Daniel from the book of Daniel. He was, he was with the Babylonian king. Now he works for Ahasuerus. And in fact, the Midrash does this on a number of occasions. They link the name, these random Persian names of these officials that are given. They connect them with other figures. So Hatach is Daniel, Memucan, who is we read him in the very beginning. He's one of the 7 who condemns Vashti. In fact, he's the one who stands up and says, this is what you should do to get rid of Vashti. According to Midrash, Memucan is Haman. Okay, so Haman was already involved. And they make a play with his name and explain why it's Haman. But nevertheless, you have these other figures reappearing. So he's killed, and then the angels intervene. Remember, this is part of a big divine drama. Okay, so then continue with 13, Stan. Then Mordecai
told Michael to reply to Esther, thus you shall say to her, do not plan for yourself to be saved in the king's house more than the rest of the Jews. Because if you continue to remain silent at this time, and you would not intercede for the Jews, relief and deliverance will proceed for the Jews from another source on account of the merit of the patriarchs of the world. And the Lord of the universe will deliver them from the hands of their adversaries. And you as well as your paternal family will perish before that guilt. And who is so wise to know if you will come to take possession of the kingdom next year at this time?
Okay, so here we have God back in. This was the big passage in chapter 4 in the biblical text where God is strangely missing, where Mordecai says, deliverance will come from another quarter. And we talked about last time how Fox had pointed out that the language is awkward. You expect to hear God there. And in fact, God is mentioned there in the Alpha text. Right? And here too in the Targum. It's going to be God that saves us, not just some mysterious another quarter. It's going to be God that saves us, because God is behind the whole thing. This is the rabbis repairing the theological problem with the text. Okay? And they will be saved on account of the merit of the patriarchs. So, zchut avot is the Hebrew term for this. This is an important theological concept that plays out in our liturgy all the time. Can you think about in the liturgy, every time we pray, where we invoke the merit of the patriarchs? The avot being mahot, so the beginning of the Amidah, the first blessing of the Amidah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu. Right, the God of our ancestors. And we go on to pray for various things, for God to act on our behalf, and we do it, and we're asking God to do this not because of our merit, but because we are the children of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And that's why God looks out for us. That goes all the way back to the Akedah, the Midrash of the Akedah, where according to the Midrash, Abraham, he's ready to go through with the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. God calls it off, but then in the biblical text, nothing more is said about it. In the Midrash, Abraham is depicted as standing to God and said, okay, I was willing to go through with this. You called it off, but now you owe me. Okay? And look what I was willing to do for you. And then the text goes on to say that then Abraham found a ram in the thicket and sacrificed the ram. So the Midrash has Abraham saying, all right, in the future, my descendants, Isaac's descendants, are going to sin, they're going to do things, and they're going to need your forgiveness. And I want you to be there for them because of what I was willing to do for you. So God responds and says, okay, see that ram in the thicket, that horn? Every year at the Rosh Hashanah, blow the horn of the ram, and I will remember what happened today. And I will grant forgiveness to your children because of what you did. That's the concept of zchut avot, the merit of the patriarchs. That's why in Rosh Hashanah, we have that whole part of the Amidah, is the shofar service, blowing the shofar a number of times, to remind God. We usually talk about it's a wake-up call to us, but according to the Midrash, it's a wake-up call to God, a reminder. Remember what Abraham did for you? Now you owe. Okay? All right, so let's continue on page 65, where I have number 9. Now we're in chapter 5. So Esther decides to intervene after Mordecai appeals to her, and she comes to the king and says, come, I have a request for you, come to this banquet with Haman, right? And she has 2 banquets. So here in chapter 5, they're at the first banquet. Pick up with verse 6. Meryl, if you want to read.
Then said the king to Esther during the wine party, what is your request, and it will be granted to you, and what is your plea? If you were to ask, your plea would be granted. Accept the request for the reconstruction of the temple. It is located within the border of half of my kingdom. I shall not grant you. For thus I have pledged an oath to Gershom the Arab, to Sanballat the Horonite, and to Tobiah the Ammonite slave, not to let it be rebuilt again, lest the Jews revolt against me.
Okay, pause there. All right, so again, the temple comes into play here. And he's like, I'll give you anything, but I'm not going to rebuild the temple because what's his concern? We promised, but
They'll revolt
the
against
revolt.
it.
Okay, so he's kind of cast like who? What other king in the Torah is concerned about this? He's concerned about the Jews revolting against him. Pharaoh, right? They become too numerous, so he enslaves them. All right, so here, King Xerxes is kind of cast in that mold. I'll do anything. This reminds me, you guys know the Meatloaf songs? Maybe a little. I will do anything for love, but I won't do that. I would do anything for love, but but I won't do that, right? This is the king. He's like, I'll give you anything, but not that. You can't ask me for the rebuilding of the temple. That's the boundary, right? Yeah.
At the time this Targum is written, there is no temple.
No temple.
And is there any hope of rebuilding it at that time? Or they already know they're not gonna rebuild the temple during their time?
During their
They know
time,
that,
no,
right?
I think there's no, I don't know. I mean, they're living under Rome.
Right.
You know, Rome is, so I mean, this, I don't know what this is saying. I mean, that just, no, the foreign ruler will never allow us to do this. I don't know, right? And that's just it, because the temple, the rebuilding of the temple is the culmination of the Jewish vision in the rabbinic mindset. That the rebuilding of the temple means the reestablishment of sovereignty in the land of Israel and the Davidic kingdom and the coming of the Mashiach and all of that. And that as accommodating as Xerxes is willing to be, he's not going to go there because he understands what that means. So maybe this is the rabbis just saying, I don't even know how to speculate on it.
Another question, where is this Targum being written? It's not in the land, it's in
The land of Israel is
It
where the
is being
scholar.
written in the land of Israel.
Yeah, this scholar who we're reading, Bernard Roosevelt, says that the Targum were composed in the land of Israel. Under Rome. Joe?
And if it was under Rome, there's no way that Rome would allow anything to be built for having another sovereign.
Right.
Not Rome.
Not Rome, no.
Not Rome.
That's why the sages in Pirkei Avot say, they say, be wary of the government. I mentioned that teaching last time. Be wary of the government. I mean, there were rabbis, who had close relationships with emperors. I mean, was it Yehuda Hanassi, I think? Ezra, remember? Is it Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who's like the good friend of the emperor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, they had connections.
But we are talking about much later.
What's that? This is much
Midrash.
later. But I mean, there were connections, I think, between Rome and the Jewish community. But still, there's this idea of you got to be wary of them. And look,
Byzance, not Rome, the eastern part of.
Yeah, the Byzantine.
The Byzantine, Christian.
You're right. It's what Rome, the Christian Rome.
Right.
The
Holy
Byzantine.
Roman.
Yeah, Byzantine. Okay, all right, so let's keep going in number 10. So after the first banquet, remember Haman goes back. Let's skip that one. We only have 4 minutes. Okay, so we have to do chapter 6. I mean, this is the big thing. Let's do the beginning of chapter 6. Okay, Joan, you want to read?
That night the outcry of women from the house of Israel ascended heaven, and their voice was heard before the Lord of the universe like the voice of young goats. And so all the supreme beings from on high were shattered. So they arose in agitation, saying to each other, perhaps the time has come for the world to be destroyed. Thus they assembled and came before the Lord of the universe. The master of the universe replied and said to them, what is this voice of young goats that I hear? Then the attribute of compassion replied, saying as follows, it is not the voice of young goats that you hear, but the voice of women from the house of Israel, who are destined to be killed upon the decree of the wicked Haman. Immediately thereupon, the Lord of the universe became filled with compassion and goodness for his people, and ordered to tear up the seal which was worn by the house of Israel, and he commanded the angel who was in charge of disturbance to descend and disturb King Xerxes, whereupon the sleep of the king became unrestful, and he rose in the morning troubled in his appearance. So he ordered Shimshai to bring the book of the Chronicles before him. When Shimshai the scribe perceived that Mordecai related concerning Bigthan and Zeresh, he turned over the pages of the book and did not wish to read. but on account of the desire from before the Lord of the universe, the pages unfolded toward
Okay. So, very different from what we have in the biblical text where it says, sleep deserted the king. You talked about last time how he just couldn't sleep and everything happened by chance. Here, God is orchestrating all of it, right? Even when he reads and he doesn't even want to read, the page is kind of unopened before him because this is God's plan. Okay, causing the king. Let me just point out a couple of things as we finish. Turn to the next page. So in chapter 8, after Mordecai, Haman is killed, Mordecai is promoted to take over, and he issues the decree about that the Jews can defend themselves from their enemies. In verse 16, where I have marked 12, the Jews, moreover, had permission to occupy themselves with the study of the law, to observe the Sabbaths and festivals, to circumcise the foreskins of their sons, and to put on the phylacteries upon their hands and their heads. Okay, this is kind of part of it. Gives a sense that under Haman, that they were persecuted, they were forbidden from doing all of these things. And maybe, that's why Mordecai and Esther had to do it in secret, and Mordecai, I don't know if he does it in secret or you would think so, he's in the palace gate. And Mordecai's elevation to the prime minister's job gives the Jews now freedom to observe their practices out of the open. And then let's look on the next page, number 13. So then they go and they start killing everybody. The text tells us that they killed 500 men in the fortress of Shushan. They killed hundreds of thousands everywhere else, Haman's, anti-Semites. But in the fortress of Shushan, they killed and destroyed 500 men, all of whom were military tribunes from the house of Amalek. Okay, so why are they doing all this slaughtering? Well, at least in part, Amalek is everywhere. And this is the Jews redeeming themselves, or destroying that threat. And let's just finish it up on the back, the origin of Purim, or the meaning of Purim. So after the victory, they institute the festival of Purim, and it says, therefore, they call these days Purim because of the lot, on account of which they observe it annually, so that they would publicize the days of the miracle and the words of this scroll to be made known to all the people of the house of Israel, that they may know why it was proper to establish these days of Purim, because on them a miracle was performed for Mordecai and Esther, and that they may be aware of the deliverance which happened to them. So we talked about last time in the biblical text, the editor seems to be giving us a sense that Mordecai and Esther took it into their own hands because things happen by chance and you can't count on God to be there. But in the rabbinic reading of the text, God is behind the whole thing. Mordecai, Esther, even the king are God's agents. And the celebration of Purim is not a celebration of chance and taking it into your own hands. It's a celebration of the miracle God performed for us, just the same way that Hanukkah is. Right? So, yes, Al-Hanisim, for the miracles that you have fought for us. So Purim is made like Hanukkah in the rabbinic mind. Okay, so that kind of finishes it, but you see different ways of reading the story, and each kind of reading is valuable because each one teaches different lessons and gives insights into life and God and circumstances and what have you. Okay, so I hope you found this stuff interesting.
I have a question.